The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. This week, activist Adam Kruggel of People's Action on building a powerful and progressive populist movement and why his organization is turning to rural and small-town America to get it done. Plus, Bill Press talks with McClatchy's Adam Wollner on making history and the biggest takeaways from the latest primary races. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. Adam Kruggel is dedicated to power for marginalized communities. He says that this is a critical moment to build a kind of populism movement that is multiracial, race-conscious, and boldly progressive. And we say hello to Adam Kruggel, who is Director of Strategic Initiatives at People's Action. Adam, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, it's certainly our pleasure to have you with us. Tell us a little bit about your organization, People's Action.
Yeah, People's Action, we are one of the largest community organizing networks in the country, and right now we have over 50 member organizations in 34 states and about 1 million active members across the country. And so we are really building an aligned political force that can help people, everyday people, gain power to really help govern what happens in their lives and build a country and an economy and a society where we put people and planet first.
Now, your organization, People's Action, recently released a report titled "The Promise of a Progressive Populist Movement." That's a compelling title. How do you define progressive populism?
No, that's a great question, because I think we were intentional with how we titled it, because we consider ourselves a populist organization, and by that we felt like it was critical at this moment in history that we reclaim this idea of populism. We believe that we are living in a populist moment, and we think that there's a lot of evidence, and I think a lot of people look at the 26th election. You look at the ascendance of somebody like Senator Sanders along with Donald Trump, and there are people who are contesting for this idea of populism. And we believe in a progressive populism. We believe in building a country that really puts people first, and that's grounded in helping everyday people, really that recognizes the ways that our system, our economic and political system, is in fact rigged, and where elites are they are gaining power, unprecedented economic and political power, at the expense of the many. And so this is really, we think it's incredibly important that we look at how do we acknowledge that truth that so many people feel, and how do we then begin to build strategies that really put people at the center of our movement and of our politics. And so we talk about it as progressive because they really are two contested ideas. What we have in the U.S. and actually all over across Europe and across the world is this surge of what we would describe as more authoritarian populism, which really we feel is incredibly dangerous. But we need what we think is a progressive and inclusive populist movement that can challenge that and can give people an alternative. So that's sort of what we mean by it. Our organizations are what we call people's organizations. They're all profoundly populist, and who we are, and we think that's at the heart of our country. But one of the things we also want to say is historically what's always sabotaged populist movements is the question of race. And so we do think it's really important that if we want to build a powerful, durable populist movement, we need to have we cannot avoid the issue of race. We need to have a race-conscious strategy, and we need to be really thoughtful about building a bigger we, and that we needs to be, help put race and gender at the center, and class all at the center of our work.
And the report serves as an introduction to a major project you're undertaking called the Rural and Small Town Organizing Strategy. What are the goals of this project?
Yeah, I think for us, we think that there is nothing less than the future of our democracy. If you look at all of the sort of political scientists right now in the country, they would say all the data shows that we actually live in an oligarchy right now where the will of the people, where the things that people care the most about are actually not being enacted by those that have been elected to serve us. And so we think that that is the larger strategy that we are attempting to undertake. And so we believe one of the major divides in our democracy that's been really exploited is the sort of urban-rural divide. And that's also played out along race and gender lines. And so our goal is, and if you look at all the data, you can see kind of how I think there's people have been alarmed by this over the last, over the 26 election results. But if you look at most states, this has been sort of this longer term strategy around, and more that you can look at what's happened in places like Wisconsin and Michigan and North Carolina, Pennsylvania, where there's been this massive divide, where we've concentrated most of our organizing efforts in large urban centers, which are incredibly important, but we've really abandoned a lot of small towns and rural areas for different reasons. But what we're saying is that those, if you want to build, there is no credible path to building governing power to change the tide of our politics right now if we are not building infrastructure in rural areas and small towns. There's just no path. You cannot. And we think there's also a deep moral imperative around how do we build bridges into communities that have been absolutely devastated by the changes in the economy, where we're seeing massive sort of deaths of despair, of overdose, or from the overdose crisis and suicide, where people can't drink water, the water is impure, their basic ways of life are being destroyed by all of the major structural changes in the economy, and there is nobody engaging them. And obviously, we've seen the decline of the labor movement. That was for many decades, sort of in a lot of places like Iowa and Minnesota and Wisconsin, the farmer labor movement were institutions that helped people build a sense of solidarity and make meaning. All of those institutions have been slowly deteriorated, and right now there's no vacuum. And more sort of nefarious kind of reactionary forces have stepped into that and are actively organizing, and there's nobody presenting an alternative vision. So we feel like that is our strategy. We're focused right now in 10 states, in 72 counties, where we feel like we can make a critical difference and really focus on and build really powerful people's organizations and begin to show people that there is an alternative. And so we're launching really, aggressive organizing strategies there, engaging people in real deep local organizing, deep listening to their concerns and issues, and then helping them build out an agenda that will actually respond and make their lives better. So that's the strategy, and we're doing it, literally, we're doing it in enough places where we think we can not only help transform those regions and states, but we think we're doing it in enough places where we can help change the direction of the country. Just a quick example, if you look at, the sort of balance of power, this last election was decided, really by 3 states in 2016, decided by 3 states. In Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Trump had a margin of victory of more than, in the counties in those same states that were organizing, he had a margin of victory of almost 300,000 votes. So we think we actually, if we engage people and build infrastructure in these counties, we can not only dramatically change the course of those communities, but we can also help change the course of our democracy. And we're seeing a lot of evidence as we build towards the midterm elections, and then we're obviously, really focused on 2020.
Mm-hmm. We're speaking with Adam Kruggel, Director of Strategic Initiatives at People's Action. Adam, there's a stereotype of rural and small-town America that it's largely white and likely to resist a call to multiracial progressive politics. It's a picture that can lead some Democrats to write off these voters. What's wrong with that picture?
Yeah, no, I think exactly right. That is, and that I think is why there's a lot of why the sort of calls from people like Donald Trump and others, like where demagogues, it resonates because there has been, far too much kind of emphasis on sort of coastal elites helping to shape our policy and vision for what we're working on, and we've missed the sort of deep wisdom of many of these areas. And so it's not to say that like racism exists in all, and sort of misogyny and all of these trends, they exist in all of our communities. There's no question about that. But the question is for us is like we're missing one. Is I think people need to realize like rural and small town America is incredibly diverse. It's actually Native Americans, African Americans are the largest and fastest growing populations in these communities, and they're only slightly less diverse. And in fact, like what we have found when we get out and talk to folks, they have a very progressive, compelling vision, but nobody's really talking to them. And we often talk in like code or in language that people don't understand. And if we're able to like address the fundamental issues that people care about and help them connect and build relationships with people across race, across gender, we have found just the most compelling, profound vision and really exciting organizing opportunities. Like we found, we're beginning this process. We've talked to over 5,000 people in these counties. And just to paint a picture of the places where we're talking to, I mean, Trump, of the 72 counties we're focusing on, Trump won 64 of them, and he won 52 of them by more than 10 points. So these are places, honestly, like when people look at the political map in their state, they don't even bother talking. These places don't get called, they don't get door knocked, they don't get mail. There's no, because the margins are so wide. But when we talk to folks, we heard something radically different. Over 80% of the people that we talked to, favored universal health care. When you look at, people overwhelmingly, when people talk about their analysis of what the problem is, they feel it's sort of that it's the power of large corporations and the wealthy and how they're taking control of our government. Folks there broad support for a lot of progressive policies, but we're not talking to them and we're not really listening to them in any meaningful way.
We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
Social Security measure. I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We'll continue our conversation with Adam Kruggel in just a moment. But first, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
If you inject a stream of raw ignorance into a vat of gaseous arrogance, then jolt the mixture with 1,000 megawatts of malevolence, what does it produce? Answer: Donald Trump's executive order of April 12th. King Donald I has been in a deep pout over negative articles about him in the Washington Post newspaper, which is owned by Jeff Bezos, king of the Amazon.com empire. King Trump fired off several rounds of angry tweets assailing King Bezos, including a potshot claiming that Amazon is, quote, ripping off the post office by underpaying for the millions of its packages the Postal Service ships. Tweets aside, Trump has the firepower of the federal government at his fingertips, so he's now arrogantly using the government to escalate his personal spat with Bezos. By executive order, he set up a federal task force to conduct a pernicious political inquisition into, quote, our money-losing post office, particularly looking at the, quote, pricing of the package delivery market. This reflects Trump's vast ignorance. Far from being a money loser, the U.S. Postal Service has actually been earning about $1 billion a year in profit. His false claim of unsustainable postal losses stems from a 2006 political ploy by right-wingers who want to destroy the public service. They passed a law dictating that USPS pre-fund retiree health benefits 75 years into the future, covering benefit costs for workers who haven't even been born, much less hired and retired. This adds a totally hokey expense of up to $5 billion a year to the USPS corporate ledger, creating the fake loss Trump is now so bombastically citing as the rationale for his destructive inquisition. This is Jim Hightower saying, sometimes public policy inadvertently turns bad, but when it's based on ignorance and arrogance, policy inevitably goes bad.
Need an antidote to the progressive blues? Want some good news about how grassroots folks are rebelling against the corporate powers and winning? Well, here's an easy-to-swallow pill for you, the Hightower Lowdown. Hightower's monthly newsletter will give you the lowdown, even as it lifts you up. It's 4 pages a month, jam-packed with facts you can use, actions you can take, and Jim's own Texas humor, all for only $15 a year. To become a lowdowner, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Still with us is Adam Kruggel, Director of Strategic Initiative at People's Action. The organization recently issued a report titled The Promise of a Progressive Populist Movement. The report is a result of thousands of interviews with people in rural and small-town America. Now, Adam, you called this effort a listening campaign. How did you go about it, and what did you learn?
Yeah, we combined, it's a great question. We combined a couple methods. So we did, like traditional public opinion polling. So we would do randomized calls to everybody that's in the voter file. So we were literally talking to anyone that would pick up their phone. And then we would also do targeted canvassing, like where we would go. And when we would go, we would literally knock on every door. So we were trying to talk to everyone, the totality of our communities that serve. And so part of the challenge we have in our politics is like we are focusing on a smaller and smaller share of the electorate. And like we made a really intentional choice to talk to as many people as possible. And so we did, in a lot of ways, we talked to a lot of folks who were much more conservative, but we were able to hear from them and understand kind of where there was common ground. And so we found out a ton of like really fascinating things. We thought, obviously like major issues like healthcare in rural America, like healthcare was overwhelmingly the greatest crisis, but quality schools, huge issue. Over 60% of folks that we talked to felt like that was the most critical thing. It's like people were incredibly concerned about the impact of the overdose crisis and opioids. It's absolutely decimated these rural areas. And overwhelmingly, people were most concerned about a lot of bread and butter issues and about sort of not being able to drink their water, about their land and air being populated. So these are all like fundamentally the kinds of issues that people who describe themselves as progressive, these are all the same issues that we care about. And so like we found that like by listening to people and hearing where they're at, our group, our member organization in North Carolina called Down Home North Carolina, they did a similar report where we were testing a lot of these outreach methods. And the title of their report is No One Ever Asked Me Before. Because that was the overwhelming theme that we found when we knocked on doors and this is all over the country, but across the Midwest and conservative areas. People said, no one has ever taken the time to actually knock on my door or to pick up the phone and call me and ask me what I thought. And so that was one of the overwhelming things. We also heard that like people were overwhelmingly when you look at like people's analysis and their understanding of like why these problems exist, overwhelmingly people felt like there was clarity. Like the number one thing is there was clarity that rich and powerful interests have really seized control of government. And so government no longer is working for the people, it's working for the wealthy and powerful. And so we found that was like incredibly interesting. We found actually, like, when you compare that to the sort of most kind of common scapegoats of immigrants or religious minorities or people of color, like those were very low on people's. They were one of the lowest rated people that people blamed. And then we found like a huge, again, I think like in rural communities, in many ways, it's local schools, public schools, and public hospitals. Those are two of the most important institutions, and there is massive support for investing to make sure that everybody has affordable health care and that we invest to improve our schools. And these are the kinds of issues. But again, also investing in our public health care and mental health infrastructure. People felt overwhelmingly. Those were like literally like super majorities in all of those. I think people were also incredibly open. The thing that surprised us is that people were also a significant portion of people, I would say, like our numbers showed like 58% of the people that we talked to really felt like it was important to address discrimination and racism. So we feel like that is, again, like there are openings to have conversations about race that we need to be having and we should not avoid, but we have to be thoughtful in how we do that. But yeah, that was what we found. I mean, we have found also, I would say, in the organizing, like we also have invited people to come out. I think over 80% of people that we talked to said that they would be willing to come to a local meeting to talk about these issues in the community. We see like there's a huge hunger for collective action. So we think that people are in these communities, they're hungry to organize. They are incredibly responsive to a lot of bold ideas, but it's important that we use a language that everyday people understand. And we think that like what we've also seen is like when we begin to get them engaged, like it's incredibly powerful. Like just an example, like in Haywood County, Waynesville, North Carolina, like within 2 months of organizing, they helped pass the first ever living wage policy in rural North Carolina in history. And they also just helped defeat a massive utility hike from Duke Energy that would have like raised people's taxes on water and helped pay for the pollution that Duke Energy created. So I think like all over we saw like in north central Iowa, like even where Congressman Steve King, who's one of the most racist, anti-immigrant, xenophobic congressmen in the country, like we've seen in his district, hundreds of people come out to rallies to help oppose the treatment, stand against the treatment of children and families on the border. We've had like folks organizing in massive numbers to help defeat factory farms that are really polluting their waters across the Midwest. So we're just seeing like a lot of really open possibility, and a lot of like the power that we can build together is incredibly inspiring.
Yeah, and the report outlines a policy agenda for addressing these concerns of the people you spoke with. Give us some quick highlights of that agenda.
Yeah, I think top of the agenda is universal health care. I think like absolutely without question, that is the most resonant, important issue that we can do as a country, and it will really help unite urban and rural America in a powerful way. We think that was like the top of the list, and we think like that's incredibly important that be a central message as people head to the polls. I think it's important that we saw a surge in 2017 of people all across rural communities and small towns organizing around this. And it's important for people to remember that in many of these communities, like their representative in Congress literally voted to kill tens of thousands of people in their district. And so that's something that people are angry about. It's very personal, and it's important that people remember that as we go to the polls. We also see like another salient, I think the other big issue that there's huge potential on is ending the overdose crisis. This has been something that has decimated rural communities, and that we need to, and again, we think has tremendous potential for helping to unite across race and unite people from urban and rural communities, and nothing has been done. Like, we're at this like massive epidemic devastation, and it's something that like we've seen in other places, like where we're seeing, like again, and like in New York, we had an incredibly the End Overdose New York campaign has been an incredibly powerful coalition that's really been grounded in folks, from Black communities in New York, working with rural communities and suburban communities, all of that have been devastated, and they're moving a really aggressive agenda to help end the overdose crisis. The other is clean water. This is something that is devastating rural communities. If you go to Iowa right now, today, over 70% of the waterways are contaminated. It's incredibly. In Wisconsin, 1.7 million people drink from unregulated water wells. Like, there's counties where over half the people cannot drink from well water. Like, these are critical issues that, again, from Flint, Michigan to Davenport, Iowa, to Hardin County to La Crosse, Wisconsin, like, people are this clean water is fundamentally a human right, and we think that this is another really important issue to help rebuild our water infrastructure. So those are some of the issues. There's a lot of other ones. I think also we need to really address the transformation of our agriculture system and to really look at how do we build sustainable and family-based farms, and we need to fundamentally restructure the Farm Bill. And so I think that's the other issue that it's really important that the Democratic Party takes seriously and begin putting forward an alternative vision of what's possible and how we can completely transform our agriculture. And then the last thing I'd say is really respect and sovereignty for Indigenous communities. It's important to remember that how widespread Indigenous communities are across our country in rural areas, and how important they can be in helping to point a new way forward. And they can also play a critical role in shifting the balance of power. We've seen that in places like Idaho, where Paulette Jordan is now won the nomination for governor, and the Democratic nomination for governor, and she is poised to become the first ever Native American woman to become a governor in this country. And we've got a historic number of Indigenous folks that are running for office right now, which is incredibly inspiring and exciting.
We're speaking with Adam Kruggel, Director of Strategic Initiatives at People's Action. The report, Adam, ends with a call to build movement politics and not politics as usual. What's the difference?
Yeah, we think that ultimately, if we want to win, we need to present, and most people in this country agree overwhelmingly, and this is in every community, but especially in rural areas and small towns, people believe that our political system is fundamentally broken. And so we need to help people. We need to basically resuscitate or revitalize the idea that democracy works and that politics can work for people. And so we call this movement politics, in that where we're not running a type of politics that's all personality-driven or candidate-driven, but that's really grounded in building broader popular movements in states and helping large numbers of people in mass be engaged in this process. And that's the only way that we can build sustainable power to win. We also believe that this kind of power needs to actually look at how do you organize around an agenda, not just around personalities but something around a coherent platform. So our process is we have candidates endorse the community in our agenda before we will ever endorse them. And the third piece is how are we financing our campaigns? We need to have alternatives to large corporate money donors, and look at how do we raising money, small dollar donations that's raised by large numbers of people. There's tremendous untapped potential, and it's the only way that we can actually have a sustainable politics that can counter a sustainable, more populist politics. So, movement politics, it's built around the movement, it's built around the people, large numbers of people engaged. There's a coherent, clear platform where people know what you stand for, and it's about a bold change, not just maintaining the status quo. And then third, it's about a different way of financing our campaigns that's really relies on large numbers of people financing rather than a small number of wealthy donors.
Who are some of the grassroots leaders you're working with?
I think one of the great candidates, I'll say this is something from our approach, we're taking a long view. And so we are between now, actually I should say between last year and 2020, we have set, as People's Action, we are recruiting 500 of our grassroots leaders and we're training them and supporting them and helping them to run for office up and down the ballot. And so we just had a real short example is there was a really high profile state Supreme Court election in Wisconsin where Rebecca Dallett, it was the first time a progressive won that seat in over 20 years. And it was an incredible campaign, and we endorsed her and supported her. But what we also did is we had over 47 of our members, like dues-paying members of Citizen Action, of our member organization, their Citizen Action Wisconsin. We also trained and prepared them to win. And like 47 of our members won local office. So it's important that like this is something that should run up and down the ballot. So people like Mary Tao, who's the first Hmong woman ever to win election to Wausau City Council, there's people up and all across Wisconsin it was critical that there were people like grassroots people running up and down the ballot that helped propel some of the top of the ticket people to ballot. And this is similar in Virginia or states all across the union. But we have folks that are running at every level that have embraced this kind of progressive populist agenda. I mentioned Paulette Jordan, who's running to become the first Native American governor in U.S. history in Idaho. Jess King is running one of the most dynamic, really populist campaigns in central Pennsylvania, and she's a member of Lancaster Stands Up. And she's really run on this, and she's a mom and a small business owner, and she's taking on one of the most entrenched Republican candidates, Lloyd Smucker, in the country. And not only does she have, they're out organizing them in the field, Lloyd Smucker hasn't shown up to a town hall meeting in over 2 years, but they're also out raising him, so they're raising more money as well. So I think we're proving that you can not only engage people and create enthusiasm to win elections and get more people involved, but you can also, raise more money if we're smart. If we actually have a compelling message that brings people off the sidelines and into the fight.
Absolutely. And in fact, we have lacked that for several years now. We need strong organization. It really starts at the grassroots level. Love what you all are doing at People's Action. And Adam Kruggel, Director of Strategic Initiatives at People's Action, joining us today. Adam, thank you so much for your time. We wish you the best of luck and would look forward to hearing back from you again soon.
Of course. Thank you so much. Have a great day. Appreciate you taking time to talk.
Oh, absolutely. We appreciate your time as well. And this is America's Democrats Podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to keep the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, on the air, and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is the America's Democrats Podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. And now Bill Press talks with McClatchy's Adam Wollner about last week's primary races, the historic firsts, and why the odds are getting better for Democrats to take back the House.
Victory in Wisconsin of Randy Bryce, otherwise known as Iron Stash, a leader of the iron workers in the state of Wisconsin, who won his primary yesterday to run for Congress for the seat formerly held by Paul Ryan. He's already pushed Paul Ryan out of the race, and now maybe in November will be coming here to Washington as, I think, the first iron worker to ever be a member of Congress. Good for the iron workers, and thank them for the support of the program. And welcome to the studio, our good friend Adam Wollner, who has changed jobs, is now moved from National Journal to McClatchy News. Hey, Adam, good to see you.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Bill.
Congrats, man. That's
we like
cool.
your new. We like your new McClatchy lineup there, outfit there.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, this
the new uniform,
standard issued. Yeah, uniform. Exactly.
I always love when the guests come in and make us look like slobs.
I know. All right. As you know, we've had lots to talk about so far, even before we get to the primaries. Peter?
Yes, indeed. We are on Twitter at
BP
Show. People are weighing in on, well, as you can imagine, lots of Omarosa comments. We have one saying Omarosa is playing the game under Trump's rules, and apparently Trump cannot handle it. Pass me the popcorn. Jim Johnson says, Bill, this is something we often ask guests here on the show. Bill often asks guests the odds of the Democrats taking the House and Senate in the election. Can he also ask the guests which sitting members of Congress are in legal trouble with Robert Mueller? That's a good idea. We should put that out there. Again, on Omarosa, in the chat room, youtube.com/TheBillPressShow, Sabrina asks, or says, Trump's N-word tape drops today. Won't make any difference. His followers will love it. And Tad says, if there are no pardons and we can get the Russians to stand trial, we could have USA versus Russia prison basketball games. Which is one way to look at it. Find us on Twitter at BP Show, or again, you can find us on the YouTube chat room. It's youtube.com/TheBillPressShow. You can watch the show, but we also have a live chat all during the morning, so check it out there.
Thank you, Peter. At the risk of spending too much time on Omarosa, the one thing that we've never talked about, Adam, you can weigh in on this too, is her claim in the book that as she was leaving the Oval Office once after a meeting after the president had met with Michael Cohen, that he was chewing on a piece of paper so that it wouldn't end up in the presidential records. Now, I don't know whether it's a true story or not, but the image of the President of the United States taking a document and then eating a little bit of it at a time, I find just so amusing.
It's so absurd.
It is so absurd, but it's not impossible.
It would be so surreal. It reminds me of this episode of It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, where the guys like eat a contract so that the lawyer like avoids getting it. I can't imagine that would actually happen in real life, but who knows?
I think I remember like when I don't know, in grade school or high school, I would chew on paper.
Yeah, right? Sure.
Yeah, but someone said it may be the healthiest thing Donald Trump ever ate. He didn't have his burrito bowl in front of him. So, Adam, you were looking at the primaries yesterday. There's a lot going on, particularly primaries in Minnesota, in Wisconsin, in Connecticut, and Vermont. What are the highlights for you?
Yeah, I guess the two big takeaways were now, two of the premier governor's races I think we're going to see in the fall are now set. One in Wisconsin, Scott Walker once again running for re-election. He's no stranger to the statewide ballot in Wisconsin, and it looks like he's probably going to face his toughest race yet. One, just because of the national environment has been looking favorable for Democrats all cycle, and Scott Walker himself has even warned that he's in for a tough race. I mean, he was really ahead of a lot of Republicans, both in Wisconsin and nationally, saying that Republicans really need to be prepared for a blue wave. And he actually said, while he was campaigning in the days leading up to the primary, he said Democrats could put Daffy Duck on the ballot and he would start with 48% of the vote. So he realizes he's going to be in for a really tight race, but he's a very experienced campaigner, knows what he's up against. He's going to be well-funded. And his opponent is going to be Tony Evers, who was the state superintendent. And it's interesting, in both Wisconsin and in Minnesota, Democrats opted for sort of a more traditional, non-controversial, you could even say centrist Democrat to go up against Republican opponents. In Wisconsin, for instance, Evers, who this is actually the first time he's even run as a Democrat. The state superintendent office in Wisconsin is actually a nonpartisan office. He beat out some slightly more liberal opponents in Malin Mitchell, who was
Malin Mitchell, the head of the firefighters.
That's right. And if you remember from the 2012 recall, he was on the ticket with Tom Barrett. Yeah. And then there was also Kelda Roy's former state representative out of Madison. He was able to beat both of them. And then you look in Minnesota, the Congressman Tim Walz, centrist Democrat, who he actually represented a district that went very heavily for Trump. In 2016, he decided not to run for re-election there. He's going to run for governor instead. And a lot of Republicans expected him to face off against Tim Pawlenty, if people remember him. He was vying for his old job, former presidential candidate, but he actually lost to Jeff Johnson, who was the nominee in 2014, so he's running again. So two big governor's races.
T. Paul's political career, it looks like, is over forever, right?
It's kind of, it's Well, someone like Pawlenty, it's kind of interesting that he chose this particular political environment to seek a comeback. Not only is it looking to be a good year for Democrats, but just the way the Republican Party is moving, he just doesn't fit the mold of where that base is moving. So interesting that sort of an establishment Republican like Tim Pawlenty gave up a very high-paying job to run for governor again.
I'd said this before, but like 10 years ago, I would have said and did say guys like John Huntsman, guys like Tim Pawlenty, they're going to have their moment in the Republican Party. Mm-hmm. And I am now ready to say I am completely wrong. I was completely wrong.
Well, because there's no Republican Party.
Exactly. They've gone so far right that there's no room for guys like Tim Pawlenty or John Huntsman anymore.
No. But I just want to note with surprise that when I asked Adam which state he was most interested in, he said Wisconsin.
Shocker, right?
Shocker. Yeah, right.
It's an interesting state.
It is. No, it is. No, and particularly interesting now. And with Tony Evers, is it
Evers, yeah.
Evers, up against Scott Walker, and the other one there is Randy Bryce.
Yeah,
Iron Stash, who's been our guest in studio here. But by the way, Tim Walz is a teacher.
Yes.
So he's a member of the teachers union. And then Randy Bryce, iron worker, and Maitland Mitchell, as you pointed out, a firefighter. But Randy,
it's almost like the unions are a big deal in Wisconsin.
They're coming back. Yeah, also, right. So Randy's got he had an uphill battle, let's face it, against the speaker. But how does that seat look now with Paul Ryan gone?
So, you'd still have to give, sort of a slight just structural advantage to the Republicans in that district. Although it is kind of a deceiving district where Paul Ryan has been there for so long and has been so popular among Republicans and even independents in that district that he's been able to win it pretty handily over the past few cycles. But it actually is a little more evenly divided than you might think. So certainly the national parties are going to be paying a lot more attention to this race than they would otherwise. You actually already saw Congressional Leadership Fund, which is a Republican-aligned super PAC that focuses on House races. They're already turning their attention to Wisconsin's first district.
And this is, by the way, we mentioned Tony Evers before moving on. Tony Evers last night telling the crowd that he beat cancer and he can beat Scott Walker.
I am a cancer survivor and have been cancer-free for almost 10 years. I beat cancer and I will beat Scott Walker.
Good campaign line.
Yeah, not bad.
Right. And while we're in Wisconsin, we mentioned Iron Stash. Iron Stash taking his vows last night as the Democratic nominee.
With your help and help from people all across the district and the country, we were able to repeal Paul Ryan. Yeah.
And he says, again, proud union man.
The fact that we are even here, that you've nominated a union ironworker from Caledonia who just over a year ago was at a job site at a local VA talking about how we weren't being represented here in Wisconsin or in Washington, D.C. It's a huge, huge win.
Yeah, it is a big move for him. I remember when he started, he came in, he was just getting started. Mm-hmm. Got a lot of attention nationwide.
Yep, yeah, raised a lot of money.
Right.
Which definitely helped. And ended up having a tougher primary, I think, than he maybe would have expected, but got through that. And now going up against a Republican in that district that's a former Paul Ryan aide.
Right. History made in the state of Vermont, for sure, where the Democratic nominee for governor, Christine Hallquist, I guess, the first transgender candidate of either major party, for governor or for anything, I think, in a major office.
Yep, for major party nominee. History made it. Yeah, and it's sort of interesting. You'd think something like that would be really sort of dominating the headlines, but has been sort of. I think her candidacy was really overlooked, I think, by a lot of people up until last night. And it's going to be interesting because, you think of Vermont, the state of Bernie Sanders, you think of it as sort of this.
Bernie Sanders, by the way, shocking, did win the Democratic primary in Vermont.
Yes, and as usual, he's going to turn it down and run as an independent. But you think in a state like Vermont, Democrats and liberal candidates would have no problem winning there, but they actually have a long history of electing Republican governors. Right. And so she's actually going to have an uphill battle, even as the Democratic candidate in that race against Phil Scott, who's the incumbent governor.
Incumbent governor, right. And here is Christine Hallquist last night saying, we did make history.
Tonight we made history. We've already made history. And I'm so honored to be recognized, to be part of this. Well, to be part of this historical moment, I guess.
But it's interesting to me that she's part of a new face, if you will, of American politics, not just the Democratic Party. So she's the first transgender candidate. Kate Brown, who is the incumbent governor of Oregon, is the first bisexual American governor. And then you've got Jared Polis, Democrat in Colorado, who's the governor of Colorado, who's a Democratic nominee for governor. And let me get his name, Lupe Valdez in Texas, openly gay candidate, Democrat for governor. So, I mean, the idea that it was like difficult for LGBTQ Americans, right, to run for office was kind of disappearing.
Right, and going back to even some more of last night's election results, Senator Tammy Baldwin, the first
right.
openly gay senator running for re-election this year, looks like she's going to be the slight favorite in her race. In a state like Wisconsin that has really swung back and forth between the two parties. So in this cycle in particular, you've seen Democrats especially have been willing to nominate really a diverse slate of candidates, whether it's transgender candidate, openly gay candidates. Particularly women. I mean, women have been doing extremely well in primaries so far this year. So it really, it's a new voice, new generation rising within the Democratic Party.
And I wanted to mention one particularly notable woman, Elan. How do you pronounce her last name? In Minnesota. Double check. Elan Omar, a Somali American, the first Somali American. So she's running for a pretty safe district, I think.
Yep. Keith Ellison.
Ellison seat. She's the first Somali American and would be together with a woman from Michigan who's actually also in a very safe district for John Conyers' seat, Rashida Tlaib. The two of them will be the first two Muslim women in the United States Congress.
Right. Yeah. And so in Minnesota she'll be likely taking over for Keith Ellison, a Muslim himself, who is going to be run, and so he's trying to make history himself at winning statewide office for the AG spot there, even as he's dealing with a lot of controversy right now. He was still able to win that Democratic nomination for Attorney General. So interesting to see these as you mentioned, they're running in these Democratic districts or areas, but still, in the Midwest, it is remarkable that these Muslim candidates are able to break through.
And another first, which I found surprising, but a first in Connecticut, Joanna Hayes is a progressive who was up against the establishment. This was sort of an Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez kind of deal, where she was up against the establishment Democratic Party candidate, but Joanna Hayes, progressive, supported by Bernie Sanders, won, and she will become the first African-American member of the congressional delegation from Connecticut.
Yeah.
I think Connecticut, that's a pretty progressive state, would have done this a long time ago.
And the other remarkable thing about that race is that the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, a Republican-leaning business group, actually made a late endorsement of her opponent. Usually, you don't see, the chamber isn't endorsing many
in the Democratic
primary. Yeah, the chamber isn't really endorsing many Democrats these days, and two, they're usually not getting involved in Democratic primaries. But they got in late. They seem to sort of miss the boat on this one, and I think maybe they wish they would have gotten in a little earlier to help their candidate.
Also in Connecticut, the Democratic nominee for governor is a former guest here of the Bill Press show, Ned Lamont. Ned Lamont.
Party like it's 2006.
I know. Yeah.
Well, Democrats would like to party like it's 2006.
Yeah, right.
Right.
Remember, it was so long ago. I mean, it was 12 years ago we had him on the show because he beat Joe Lieberman in the Democratic primary in Connecticut. And then Lieberman
turned around
and ran as an independent and ended up winning and beating Ned Lamont. But we had Ned Lamont on the show a lot.
Yeah,
a decade ago.
Right, and then Lieberman became John McCain's first choice for vice president.
Oh,
and the Republican Party wouldn't let him do it, and so he said, "All right, well, we'll take a flyer with Sarah Palin."
How'd that work out?
Yeah, how did that work out? Another thing that did happen yesterday was not a result of a primary this week, but last week's primary is in Kansas. The governor, Jeff Collier, Peter, we got that clip. The governor, Jeff Collier, finally threw in the towel to Chris Kobach. Here he is.
I've just had a conversation with the Secretary of State, and I congratulated him on his success, and I repeated my determination to keep this seat in Republican hands.
Yeah. So very, very close.
Mm-hmm.
I thought that was one that could flip. It was like 190 votes or something. Wasn't
Yeah.
it? But
and it's too bad that it took them this long to count all the votes.
Well, I was shocked
that's all right. They still haven't finished in Ohio 12.
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
I was shocked that happened yesterday because the last time we talked about it, which was like Friday, there were all sorts of discrepancies. There were all kinds of problems. And the most recent count was like 90 votes because it was 191 and it turns out
that close. Yeah.
It was 191 and it turns out that there was a discrepancy on one of the websites that gave Kobach 100 more votes than he actually had. And it was down to literally 90 votes for the entire state. And so how we went from there on Friday to him conceding on Monday or Tuesday,
right?
I don't know how that works out, but I guess he felt comfortable.
Well,
enough
I'm sure
to
they
do
looked
it.
at the math and they just realized there were just not enough potential votes.
Yeah,
right?
and another win for a Trump endorsee as well. He's got a pretty good track record in the Republican primaries, but how those candidates are going to do in the general election, obviously Trump's going to be a totally different factor in November than he is in these summer primaries.
Saw a story of yours about Trump's the Mormon faith and how Trump might either turn off votes there or help votes, or what do you say?
Yeah,
so
it's interesting. So back in 2016, Mormon voters who it's a very small part of the population. Less than 2% of Americans are Mormons, but they have historically been the most reliable Republican voting group of any religious group in the country, and that's particularly felt out in the Mountain West states like Utah, Nevada, Arizona that have disproportionately large Mormon populations. And so a lot of Mormons were not on board with Trump during the 2016 primary. Some of them sort of hesitantly came around to him in the general election.
After Mitt Romney's speech.
Right. Well, right. Mitt Romney and a lot of Mormons, a lot of other Mormon politicians were sort of leading the charge against Trump during the 2016 elections. And you even see now someone like Jeff Flake, who is Mormon, being one of the leading anti-Trump voices among Republicans in the Senate. So you look, you take a look at the results and you might think, oh, well, 60% of Mormons still voted for Trump and 60% of Mormons still approve of him today. That seems pretty good. But if you compare that to where other Republican presidential candidates or presidents have been, it's actually much lower. I mean, really, Republican presidents should be looking for approval in the 80s among Mormons. So if there's any sort of drop-off among them going into the 2018 midterms, that can make a big difference in states that are looking at pretty tight contests. Arizona Senate, Nevada Senate, even Utah, Mia Love's district there is going to be a competitive race. So basically just the reporting that I did found that a lot of Mormons are still very hesitant about Trump. And you kind of find a wide range. On the one extreme end, I found some Mormons who are just done with the Republican Party altogether because of Trump, aren't going to come out to vote for them this fall. Others, I think maybe are still going to sort of hold their nose and still vote for the Republican candidates this fall, even as they're sort of against some of the things Donald Trump is doing.
Well, I was going to say, what is their beef with Trump?
So, I mean, there's two major things. I mean, one is the sort of the character issues. That's been one of the main problems from the beginning. But more specifically to some of the policies he's been putting forward, his hardline immigration policy has really turned off a lot of Mormons because for Mormons, a lot of them, have not so distant ancestors that were forced to migrate out west due to religious persecution. And the Mormon Church actually even released a rare statement. They usually don't get involved in politics, but they released a statement criticizing Trump's family separation policy at the border. So that's a clear issue where the Republican Party is moving right on that, but they're sort of alienating Mormons who have been a key part of their base now for the last few decades on that.
Right. But Romney, Mitt Romney, has sort of gone underground, hasn't he? When it comes to he's not out there as the chief critic of Donald Trump anymore.
No, not anymore. And Romney can sort of play it a little safer because he's running for Senate now in Utah statewide, which is still very Republican, obviously overall, and just given his stature among the Mormon community and among Republicans out there, he can sort of create a brand separate from Trump and isn't really forced to weigh in on Trump every day the way that maybe some other candidates are. So I think for Romney, he realizes he's kind of found this calculus where, he maybe will find a couple issues here and there to distance himself from Trump. I don't think he's going to go out of his way to poke the bear, which is what I think a lot of Republican candidates are looking to do in 2018.
Right. And Orrin Hatch has become one of Trump's biggest defenders.
Yes. Yeah. And he was skeptical of him in 2016, but he came around. So it's been interesting to see how various Mormon voters, how various Mormon politicians have sort of decided to deal in their own ways with Trump.
Right. So the question, you follow all these midterms, and the question we ask each of our political reporters that come in is, on a scale of 1 to 10, right? What do you think the chances of Democrats taking back the House? Where do you put it?
Well, yeah, I guess I would say better than 50-50 at this point. So I guess if I'm going on a scale of 1 to 10, maybe it's a 6 or a 7, I guess. I think that they've got to be feeling pretty good about their chances, just because, the map right now is just so large. They have so many targets to choose from. And if they're, Ohio 12, if they're able to compete in a district like that, this fall, that's not even one that they would necessarily need to take back the
right.
House
So
in November.
we keep doing the math. They need to win 23. Obviously, they'd like to have more than 23 because they'd like to have a little margin, right? But they need 23, and there are, 90, 100, 110, 20 seats, competitive seats.
Yeah, it depends on how you're exactly classifying competitive, and I think that number is definitely going to shrink as we get into the fall, and the parties have to sort of decide where to put their limited resources. But I think Democrats have to be feeling pretty good about their odds right now, given just the special election results we've seen, what we're seeing in terms of turnout in a lot of these states, and also just the way Republicans are really have been sort of struggling among the suburban part of the electorate. And I think that's really where it's going to be won or lost. If Democrats can make significant grounds in some of these suburban districts, it's going to be really tough for Republicans to hold them off.
Even if the Ohio 12 thing is resolved, I wouldn't be surprised at all if it's resolved that Troy Balderson squeaks in by 1,000 votes or something like that. Right. Republicans can't feel good about that. That Treberry, was that his name, who held that district?
T-Berry, yeah. Pat T-Berry, yep.
He won it by 36 points the last time.
Right. And of course, special election.
They can barely win it by 1,000 points in 2 years. That spells trouble nationwide.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And it raised a lot of alarm bells for Republicans. And of course, special elections are sort of their own beasts where, everyone's focused on one House race, and there's a lot of, there's not going to be the same sort of attention paid to Ohio 12, for instance, in November by both the media and by national political groups. But just the fact that there are going to be so many more competitive districts on the map seems to bode well for Democrats.
That's all for the America's Democrats podcast. Thank you to all who made today's show possible, Adam Kruggel and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. For the America's Democrats podcast, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.